The sun had begun its slow descent behind the rolling hills of Ilaria, painting the fields in molten gold. Tomas, a human farmer, wiped sweat from his brow and felt the satisfying ache of a day's honest labor. His hands were calloused, skin cracked from years of tending the earth. Life was simple here, not easy but real. Every seed planted and every harvest reaped had meaning. It was a rhythm he knew in his bones, a sacred dialogue with the soil beneath his feet. As he guided his oxen along the furrows, a subtle vibration rose from the ground. At first, Tomas ignored it, attributing the hum to wind through the wheat. But the sound grew, rising in pitch until it became a resonance that shook the air itself. The sky fractured above, light bending in strange, shimmering arcs. Heart thudding, Tomas stumbled back. His mind screamed at him to flee, but before he could react, the world twisted violently. A blinding flash swallowed him. One moment he smelled earth and wheat. The next he smelled metal and ozone. Tomas blinked against the brightness and realized he stood on a vast platform, suspended above a city that gleamed like a constellation. Towering figures with skin like liquid crystal surrounded him. Limbs moved with fluid elegance, eyes reflecting swirling galaxies. "Welcome, human," a being said, its voice a melodic vibration that seemed to pulse inside Tomas's chest. "You are far from your fields, far from your soil. We have observed your species. You intrigue us." Fear clutched him, but he forced himself to stay upright. These creatures, Veyari, he would later learn, were not just intelligent. They were majestic, almost terrifying in their poise. Their gaze alone seemed to weigh his very soul. "You will serve us," another intoned. "You will teach us what it means to cultivate, to nurture, to live in harmony with life itself." Tomas felt the air thicken. Serve them? He had spent his life tending land, not bowing to strangers no matter how powerful. Yet when ethereal chains wrapped around his wrists and ankles, he realized resistance was futile, and yet even as despair rose, a spark ignited in him. Humans survive because we endure. We do not bend easily. Days, or whatever measure of time existed aboard the Veyari vessel, blurred into one another. Tomas was fed, sheltered, and instructed in their language and ways. Yet he was never free. The Veyari excelled in logic and design, in prediction and precision. But they lacked patience with the organic rhythms Tomas understood, the slow miracle of seed to sprout, the careful tending of life, the quiet pride in nurturing something to fruition. Tomas watched and learned, storing every detail, their hierarchies, their habits, their arrogance. And in those observations a plan began to form, not of escape but of transformation. If he was to survive, he needed more than compliance. He needed to become essential. One evening, as twin suns dipped low, casting prismatic shadows across the platform, Tomas approached a scholar named Leora. Unlike the others, her curiosity about humans burned brightly, a flicker of light in the otherwise cold logic of their kind. "I can teach you," Tomas said softly, "not merely to endure but to thrive. You seek growth, order, and life itself. Without understanding patience, care, and resilience, you will never achieve it." Leora's eyes shimmered like liquid starlight. "Show me," she whispered. "Teach me what you know." In that moment, Tomas felt the first stirrings of hope. The seed of influence had been planted, not in Ilaria, but in the minds of those who had stolen him from it. He would not remain a prisoner. He would become a teacher, a guide, perhaps something even greater. Looking over the alien city, a faint smile touched his lips. Humans' greatest strength had never been muscle or technology. It was spirit. And that spirit, once awakened here among the stars, could reshape the cosmos itself. Tomas inhaled deeply, the scent of the unknown filling his senses. Somewhere beyond fear and uncertainty lay the beginning of a story far larger than he had ever imagined. And he, a simple human farmer, would be at its center. The Veyari city shimmered under twin suns, its crystalline towers reflecting light in patterns that made Tomas's head spin. Yet, even amidst their grandeur, he found a rhythm that the Veyari had overlooked, a rhythm born of patience, persistence, and care. The first days aboard the vessel had been terrifying, but Tomas had survived. Now survival alone was not enough. He needed to grow roots even in this alien soil. He began quietly, speaking to Leora in their melodic language. She had a thirst for understanding, a hunger that mirrored his own. Every evening, after the others retired, He demonstrated the simplest acts of cultivation: how to prepare soil, how to nurture tiny sprouts, how to read the subtle signals of life that no algorithm could predict. Leora listened, enraptured, her luminous eyes reflecting every gesture, every word. "You speak of patience," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why does it matter? The seeds will grow in time, yes? Will they not?" Tomas smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind his ear. "Time is not enough. Growth is not mere waiting. It is understanding. It is attention. It is love. Without these, even the strongest seed will falter." She considered this, a faint ripple of comprehension crossing her face. "Love, growth. It is not quantifiable. You humans are strange creatures," Tomas chuckled. "Strange, yes, but in strange ways, powerful." Word of Thomas's lessons spread quietly at first, like a faint current through the Veyari community. Scholars, curious observers, and even leaders began to seek him out. They asked questions about soil, water, and seasons, but he guided them toward something larger: understanding the value of patience, the discipline of care, and the subtle power of human resilience. Yet influence brought conflict. Some Veyari resisted. They saw Tomas not as a teacher but as an anomaly, a flawed being unworthy of attention. In council halls of light, they debated his worth. "Why waste time on an inferior species?" they hissed. "He knows nothing of science, of governance, of order." But Tomas was not intimidated. Humans had long survived because they adapted, because they endured, because they turned weakness into strength. And slowly, the Veyari began to see what he offered. What he lacked in knowledge of their technology, he compensated with insight into the fundamental force that guided all life: care, persistence, and the ability to endure even when the universe seemed to conspire against you. One day, a Veyari elder named Silent approached him. "Human," Silent said, voice like the chiming of glass. "You speak of these qualities, and yet your species is small, fragile, and easily broken. How can these traits give you power here?" Tomas met his gaze steadily. "Fragile? Perhaps. But our fragility is also our strength. Every challenge we face, every hardship we endure, every loss we survive, it makes us stronger in ways you cannot measure. Power is not only in force, it is in endurance, in wisdom, in heart, and sometimes it is in the smallest beings that the greatest storms begin." Silent's eyes widened, not with fear, but with reluctant recognition. Something in Thomas's words struck a chord he could not articulate, a truth beyond logic. The seeds of influence were growing, subtle but undeniable. At night, Tomas would gaze down at the alien city, feeling the weight of his isolation and the spark of possibility intertwined. He missed Ilaria, the feel of soil between his fingers, the smell of rain on wheat. Yet here, among the Veyari, he realized something extraordinary. He could reshape not just their understanding, but their world itself. The more he taught, the more they learned, and the more they learned, the more dependent they became on him. Tomas began to see a vision, a world in which humans were not merely fragile creatures to be observed, but teachers, leaders, and guides. A world in which resilience, spirit, and empathy could redefine power itself. But the path was fraught. Envy, skepticism, and fear brewed among those who resisted change. Every lesson he imparted was a battle, every smile a shield against doubt. Yet Tomas endured because humans had endured before him, and in that endurance lay a quiet, indomitable strength. And as the twin suns set once more over the crystalline towers, Tomas allowed himself a small, private thought. The journey from prisoner to teacher was only the beginning. Someday he would not merely influence them, he would lead them. And when that day came, the Veyari would understand in their hearts the extraordinary power of a human soul. Tomas had settled into a rhythm within the Veyari city, yet every day felt like walking on the edge of a blade. Teaching Leora and the others about patience and resilience was one thing. Navigating their intricate social structures was quite another. The Veyari were brilliant, yes, but brilliance came with pride. Even the smallest recognition could provoke envy. And Tomas, the human farmer, was an outsider whose very existence challenged their assumptions about power and knowledge. He noticed it first during a council meeting of elders, luminous beings whose forms shimmered like liquid crystal. They debated strategies for resource distribution, agricultural design, and environmental management. concepts Tomas knew intimately but on scales far beyond human imagination. Yet the discussions were rigid, confined to theory and algorithms devoid of the subtle understanding of living systems. "Your methods are unorthodox," one elder hissed, his voice cutting like a chime of metal. "How can we trust the guidance of a creature so limited?" Tomas met the gaze steadily, feeling neither fear nor anger. Because real growth is not in precision alone. It is in understanding the life you serve. You calculate, you predict, you control, but the heart of life is not a formula. You cannot bend it to your will. You must nurture it. And in that nurturing you will find a strength greater than any machine or algorithm. A ripple of murmur passed through the chamber. Some elders bristled, others leaned forward, intrigued. Tomas could feel the first stirrings of influence beyond Leora. He had entered the council as a human captive. Now, slowly, he was becoming something more. A teacher whose words carried weight, whose understanding of life itself could sway the decisions of gods. Yet power came with tension. There were whispers, small and sharp, that Tomas had no right to teach, no right to interfere, no right to shape their city. The resistance was subtle but pervasive. A group of ambitious scholars, led by a tall, silver-eyed Veyari named Velis, began to scrutinize him. They questioned his methods, mocked his patience, and sowed doubt among those who listened. Tomas did not respond with anger. He had learned long ago that confrontation rarely achieves change. Instead, he observed, learned, and acted strategically. He noticed Velis's arrogance masked a deep insecurity, a fear of being overshadowed. Tomas filed the observation away, silently crafting the threads of influence he would later weave into power. Evenings were his sanctuary. Leora remained by his side, her curiosity unending. She asked questions not just of agriculture but of life, emotion, and survival. Tomas shared memories of Ilaria, the smell of rain-soaked soil, the feel of wheat bending under the wind, the quiet triumph of a harvest after months of labor. She listened, enraptured, her crystalline eyes reflecting not just light but comprehension. "You teach more than farming," she said one night. "You teach patience, courage, the strength of the human spirit." "It is intoxicating," Tomas smiled faintly. "It is survival, Leora. That is all humans have ever done: survive, adapt, endure. But surviving is not enough. One must also nurture, one must also inspire. That is how small beings can become more than their size, more than their limits." His words spread further than he realized. Slowly, Veyari beyond Leora began to approach him, seeking guidance, asking questions, and implementing his methods. The first successful crops grown under human principles, a mix of patience, care, and adaptation, flourished in spaces where the Veyari had predicted failure. Tomas watched as their awe grew, subtle at first, then undeniable. And yet the more he succeeded, the more danger loomed. Velis and his faction grew restless, plotting to discredit him, to remind the Veyari Council that Tomas was an outsider, a fragile human whose experience was trivial against their centuries of knowledge. Tomas understood the game he now played. It was no longer about survival nor about teaching alone. It was about leadership. Influence, when wielded wisely, could become power. And power, he knew, must be earned in small victories, carefully sown like seeds in fertile soil. At night, Tomas stood at the edge of the platform overlooking the city, twin suns sinking beneath crystalline spires. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight of his journey. From a simple farmer on Ilaria, he had become a teacher, an advisor, a subtle force among the Veyari. The next step, he realized, required more than patience. It required courage, cunning, and the unshakable belief that even a human, so small, so fragile in appearance, could shape the destiny of a civilization. The first harvest of power was his. And Tomas knew, deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning. Tomas had grown into his role as a teacher, his influence spreading quietly through the Veyari city. Scholars who had once scoffed at him now came to watch his techniques, to learn the delicate balance between patience and precision. Even some council members who had doubted him began to consult his advice. Yet with influence came scrutiny. Tomas understood that in a society as brilliant and proud as the Veyari, admiration could quickly turn into envy, and envy into schemes. Velis, the silver-eyed scholar, had become more than a rival. He was a shadow stalking Tomas at every step. He whispered to others, questioning Tomas's methods, subtly undermining the human's approach. "A creature so fragile cannot understand the strength needed to lead us," he would say, voice dripping with condescension. "Do you wish to be deceived by sentiment?" Tomas did not respond openly. Confrontation would only feed Velas's pride. Instead, he worked quietly, observing the networks of loyalty and doubt that crisscrossed the Veyari Council. He realized leadership was less about force than about trust, influence, and subtle guidance. Every question asked by the curious became a thread he wove into an invisible web of allegiance. One evening, Leora approached him with a tension he had not seen before. "Velas plans to challenge you," she said, her luminous eyes reflecting worry. "He has gathered a faction and intends to present evidence to the council that your methods are flawed, unworthy of consideration." Tomas listened, nodding slowly. His hands rested lightly on the table, steady as ever. "Then we prepare," he said softly. "Not with anger, not with force, but with proof, with patience, with clarity that cannot be ignored." The next days were a delicate dance. Tomas guided his followers to demonstrate the results of their methods. Crops thriving in controlled spaces. Complex irrigation systems improved with human insight. Subtle improvements in the city's environmental balance. Velas attempted to discredit him at every turn, presenting calculations and projections meant to show human methods as inferior. But the evidence of life itself, the flourishing of what Tomas nurtured, could not be dismissed. During a council meeting, Velas presented his challenge with the elegance of a blade. "These methods are unusual," he said, voice echoing through the crystalline chamber. "They lack the precision our species relies upon. They are human and therefore limited." Tomas stepped forward calmly, every movement deliberate. "And yet," he replied, voice steady and strong, "these methods produce results. Life thrives where you predicted failure. Precision is valuable, yes, but it cannot replace understanding. And understanding is what humans offer." The chamber fell silent. Even Velas felt the weight of truth in Tomas's words. A murmur of agreement spread through some council members, subtle yet undeniable. The human's influence was undeniable. He had turned skepticism into curiosity and curiosity into cautious respect. But victory was never without risk. Later that night, Tomas discovered that Velas had attempted a covert sabotage, trying to divert water supplies to undermine the human-taught irrigation. Tomas caught it just in time, redirecting the flow to save the crops. He realized then that leadership was not merely about knowledge, it was about vigilance, foresight, and the courage to act decisively in moments of danger. Standing atop the platform later, looking over the city, Tomas felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The Veyari were not invincible. They could be manipulated by arrogance and envy, but he had learned their patterns, their strengths, and their weaknesses. And he understood something profound. Humans survived not because they were strong, but because they were adaptable, because they endured, and because they could turn adversity into advantage. Leora joined him, her presence a calm anchor. "You are changing them," she whispered. "I see it. You are more than a teacher. You are becoming something greater." Tomas smiled faintly, the glow of the twin suns reflecting in his eyes. "Not yet," he said. "Influence is not power. Observation, patience, and understanding are the roots. Power grows from the fruits, and the first fruits are yet to come." As night fell over the crystalline towers, shadows stretched long, weaving through the city like threads of fate. Tomas had survived fear, captivity, and doubt. Now he faced the more subtle threats of envy and betrayal. But he understood the truth. Leadership was not taken by force alone. It was earned, nurtured, and protected. And Tomas, the human farmer who had once tilled the soil of Ilaria, was learning to sow a different kind of harvest, a harvest of influence, loyalty and power that no Veyari could ignore. And somewhere deep within him, a quiet determination burned. If the Veyari believed themselves gods, he would show them the power of humanity. Tomas stood in the council chamber, a room that shimmered with crystalline light and hummed with the low resonance of the Veyari energy grids. The twin suns above bathed the chamber in a golden glow, casting long prismatic shadows across the floor. Today was different. Today, Tomas was no longer simply a teacher. He was a contender for influence, and every gaze in the chamber turned toward him with anticipation, curiosity, and for some, resentment. Valus had grown bold. The silver-eyed scholar had rallied a faction, calling for Tomas's methods to be abandoned and for human interference to be restrained. "He is clever," Valus said, voice slicing through the air like sharpened crystal. "But his methods are primitive, emotional, and ultimately dangerous. We cannot allow sentiment to dictate our governance." Tomas listened, calm and steady, absorbing the words without flinching. He had expected confrontation. He had prepared for it. "Primitive?" he said finally, his voice even but resonant with conviction. "Perhaps. But these methods produce results. Life thrives where your calculations predicted failure. Growth cannot always be reduced to numbers. Some truths exist beyond logic. This is what humans understand, and it is a strength, not a flaw." A murmur ran through the council. Some Veyari were visibly impressed. Others frowned, unsure how to reconcile centuries of rigid thinking with the results of human methods. Tomas knew that influence was shifting. He could feel it like a tide turning beneath the surface. He had prepared a demonstration. Within the chamber, he guided the Veyari to a new agricultural module, a space where crops were failing under purely calculated care. Tomas instructed them in the human way, observing the soil, adjusting water by feel, altering sunlight exposure subtly, nurturing each plant individually. The transformation was rapid, almost miraculous. The crops responded, leaves unfurling with vigor, stalks strengthening in defiance of earlier predictions. Leora's eyes shone as she watched. "You do not merely survive," she whispered. "You change everything you touch." Valus, however, seethed. His calculations had failed. His predictions, though flawless on paper, could not compete with human intuition. "This is luck," he shouted, though even he knew it was not. Tomas simply smiled. "Luck favors the prepared, yes," Tomas said softly. "But it is observation, understanding, and endurance that create outcomes consistently. Humans endure, adapt, and innovate precisely because we must. We turn adversity into advantage. That is our strength." The council was quiet. Tomas realized that he was not merely teaching. He was demonstrating a philosophy of life that the Veyari could not ignore. Slowly, one by one, scholars began to nod in agreement. Even Valus could not deny the results, though pride kept him silent. But power was never won without cost. That night, Tomas discovered subtle acts of sabotage. Irrigation lines tampered with, nutrients misdirected, and minor data manipulated. Valus had tried again, this time more covertly. Tomas calmly traced each problem back, correcting it without exposing his knowledge immediately. Every act of resistance only sharpened his understanding of Veyari politics. Influence, Tomas realized, was not merely about demonstrating results, it was about understanding fear, ambition and envy, and turning them into allies rather than enemies. In private, Leora approached him. "You are becoming more than we imagined," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "The Veyari are listening. They are beginning to see the human advantage." Tomas looked out over the city from the platform above, where the twin suns dipped toward the horizon, casting the towers in shimmering gold and violet. "The advantage," he said quietly, "is not in brute force or technology. It is in the human spirit. Adaptation, endurance, the courage to act when others hesitate. That is something no algorithm, no calculation, no arrogance can replicate." He felt the weight of his journey, from a simple farmer on Ilaria to a human teaching alien gods how to nurture life. Each small victory built his authority. Each challenge honed his instincts. The Veyari could calculate the universe, predict outcomes, and bend technology to their will, but they could not yet understand the subtle force that drove a human to persevere against impossible odds. And Tomas, standing among stars and crystalline spires, understood that the tide was turning. Influence was becoming leadership. Leadership, when paired with the indomitable human spirit, could become power. The first wave of true authority had begun. And soon, he knew, the Veyari would learn that a human could rise not by might, but by mind, spirit, and the courage to endure, and ultimately, by the wisdom to lead. The city of the Veyari shimmered beneath twin suns, each tower reflecting light in a kaleidoscope of brilliance. Yet beneath that beauty, tension simmered. Tomas had become more than a teacher. He was a force reshaping the way the Veyari thought about life, growth, and leadership. And with that influence came resistance, fierce and dangerous. Valus had grown desperate. He could no longer hide his disdain behind subtle whispers or passive sabotage. Now he openly challenged Tomas, rallying a faction of Veyari who feared change and resented the human who had, in their eyes, overstepped his bounds. "He is clever, yes," Valus hissed to the council one morning. "But cleverness does not equate to authority. We are gods in our own right. He is only a fragile creature. Remove him before his influence spreads further." Tomas listened, his expression calm, eyes steady. He had anticipated this moment. Leadership, he knew, was tested in crisis, and this was the crucible. "Fragile," he said finally, voice resonant, "does not mean powerless. Even the smallest seed can grow into a tree that bends the storm. Leadership is not the right to command. It is the responsibility to nurture, to endure, and to inspire. That is what humans bring," Valus sneered. But some council members paused, doubt flickering across their faces. Tomas seized the moment. "Tonight," he continued, "I will demonstrate not with words, but with action." By evening, Tomas had rallied his followers, scholars and workers who had witnessed the success of human methods, who had come to trust the guidance of the farmer-turned-teacher. Together, they approached the largest agricultural module in the city, a sprawling field of fragile crops designed to withstand only precise mechanical care. Veyari had predicted failure, yet Tomas had seen opportunity. He instructed his followers to apply subtle changes, adjusting nutrient flows, observing the plant's responses and responding intuitively rather than algorithmically. Leora assisted, her hands moving with deliberate care under Tomas's guidance. Within hours, the crops began to thrive, their growth surpassing even human expectations. Leaves shimmered brighter, stalks strengthened, and flowers bloomed in patterns of breathtaking symmetry. Word of the success spread through the city like a ripple, reaching council chambers, observation platforms, and even Valus himself. The rebellion was challenged not by force but by undeniable evidence of skill, patience, and insight. Tomas had proven that leadership was not about dominance, it was about results, trust, and the ability to endure under pressure. Valus's faction faltered, their confidence shaken. Tomas did not gloat. He never did. Instead, he reached out with quiet diplomacy. "Change is not a threat," he told the doubters. "It is a path to strength. We do not reject one another's knowledge, we combine it. Adaptation does not diminish the Veyari. It elevates them." Some still resisted, but others, inspired by the success, began to follow Tomas's guidance willingly. The human who had been kidnapped and brought among them had transformed fear into respect, skepticism into admiration. Leadership, Tomas realized, was as much about guiding hearts as it was about guiding actions. That night, standing atop the tallest spire, Tomas looked over the city. Lights flickered in the crystalline towers, a testament to both the brilliance and fragility of the Veyari civilization. He thought of Ilaria, of the fields he had tilled, the seasons he had endured, and the storms he had survived. The lessons of humanity, the resilience, the courage, the patience, the empathy were his secret weapons. Leora approached, her luminous eyes reflecting both pride and awe. "You have changed them," she whispered. "Even those who doubted are now listening." Tomas nodded, feeling a quiet surge of determination. "This is only the beginning," he said. "Leadership is not a single victory nor a single harvest. It is the sum of choices, sacrifices, and the courage to endure every challenge. Humanity survives because we endure, because we adapt, because we believe in tomorrow even when all seems lost. That is what I bring, and it is what they will follow if they are wise." Above the city, the twin suns set in a blaze of gold and violet, casting long, prismatic shadows over the towers. Tomas felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Soon he would face the ultimate test, not just guiding the Veyari, but uniting them, reshaping their civilization, and proving that a human, a simple farmer, could rise to a place no one had ever imagined. And somewhere deep in his heart, he knew the time was coming when the Veyari would see not a fragile human among them, but a leader, a force, a ruler whose vision would stretch across the stars themselves. The Veyari city had changed. Where once there were sterile, crystalline towers gleaming with cold precision, now gardens flourished between them, living bridges of green and gold breathing life into glass and light. Waterways curved like silver veins, nourishing crops and flowers that pulsed with faint luminescence. The Veyari had learned not just to build, but to nurture. And at the center of it all stood Tomas, the human farmer who had taught an alien civilization how to grow again. He had never sought power, yet power had come to him naturally, drawn by trust and by proof. His leadership was not written into law, it was written into hearts. Council members who had once argued against him now deferred to his wisdom. Even Velas, proud and humbled, had bowed his head in quiet acknowledgement. The city's hum that once resonated with mechanical rhythm now carried the pulse of life. Tomas walked through the newly grown fields with Leora at his side. She had changed too. The once curious scholar had become something like a believer. "It is strange," she said softly, her iridescent skin catching the light. "Our people lived for ages without understanding the simplest truth, that to rule is to serve, to nurture, to care. You taught us this, Tomas of Ilaria, and now they call you the supreme custodian." Tomas smiled faintly, his weathered hands brushing over the alien leaves. "I taught nothing new," he said. "I only reminded you of what life already knows. Growth, balance, and care, they are the oldest truths of all." But even as harmony bloomed, Tomas knew the weight of leadership was never light. The Veyari looked to him not only for wisdom, but for guidance through uncertainty. Beyond their shining world, other species watched, some in awe, others in suspicion. The universe had noticed that the once proud Veyari had bowed to a human, and that, Tomas knew, would invite challenge. A council meeting was called, the first of its kind under Tomas's leadership. Representatives gathered in the Hall of Mirrors, where light danced across walls that reflected every face. Tomas stood before them, calm and grounded. "My friends," he began, his voice steady yet filled with quiet power, "our people have flourished not because we conquered, but because we listened to each other, to our world, to the rhythm of life itself. But peace is not a gift freely given. It is cultivated like a harvest through patience and unity." A hush fell over the hall. The Veyari, beings once bound by logic alone, now felt something deeper: emotion, empathy, purpose. Leora stepped forward. "You speak of unity, Tomas, and yet beyond our stars there are those who see your leadership as weakness, those who still believe that strength is domination." Tomas nodded slowly. "Then we will show them a new kind of strength. The strength to build, not destroy. To protect, not to control. The strength of those who have learned that life in all its forms deserves respect." The council rose in unanimous agreement. For the first time in Veyari history, every faction stood united, not by fear, not by power, but by conviction. Later that night, Tomas returned to the highest spire, the same platform where he had first stood as a captive, confused and afraid. The wind whispered softly across the city's luminous fields. Leora joined him, her gaze distant, thoughtful. "You could return to Ilaria if you wished," she said quietly. "Your world still spins beneath its sun. Do you not miss it?" Tomas smiled gently. "I miss its simplicity, its silence. But life took me elsewhere for a reason. A farmer plants seeds where the soil is ready. My soil is here now." He looked at the stars, at the infinite tapestry of creation, and a memory stirred. The sound of rain on his farmhouse roof, the smell of freshly tilled earth, the quiet peace of a day's honest work. He realized that he had not lost his home. He had carried it within him all along. The Veyari called him the supreme custodian, but he thought of himself as something simpler, a gardener of souls. He had not conquered the Veyari. He had cultivated them, shown them the quiet, enduring strength of humanity. As dawn rose over the crystalline horizon, casting the city in golden rose, Tomas turned to Leora. "When I first came here, I was a prisoner," he said softly. "Now I stand among friends. They took a farmer from his field, but they returned him as their ruler. Yet I will never forget what makes me human." Leora smiled, her expression serene. "And that," she whispered, "is why they follow you." Tomas looked once more at the sprawling city, a living garden that reached toward the stars, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his heart. Humanity's strength was not in conquest, not in domination, but in creation, compassion, and courage. And in this distant world of light and crystal, that truth had taken root. As the twin suns rose higher, their rays breaking over the shimmering towers, Tomas of Ilaria, the farmer, the teacher, the human, stood at the pinnacle of an empire reborn. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and smiled. The harvest was complete.